Understanding Worry Management. Case Study. Amanda's Story. I'm 34 years old, and I guess I've always been a worrier. Looking back, ever since school, I thought I found worrying helpful. It made me feel better prepared for exams and coursework. Also, at work, I felt worrying kind of prepared me for the worst case scenarios, made me feel more in control and like ultra prepared for anything that might come my way. I can't really pinpoint exactly when my worry started to become really unhelpful and have negative impacts on my life. I suppose about 18 months ago, I found myself worrying more and more about lots of different things. My mum lived on her own, and I constantly worried things were going wrong with her or her house, or that she might fall over and not be able to get back up or get any help. Then things started to become tough at work. I lost a big contract and worried that my boss was going to sack me. I found it harder to concentrate, so I ended up working longer and harder and not getting home on time. I became really exhausted and I started to worry about my health. I also found myself in situations at work where my boss would ask me something and my mind would just go blank. You guessed it, it made me worry even more. I thought I might be getting the sack, or that I was useless at my job, and that nobody would want to hire me if I did get the sack. My persistent worry then also started to cause me strain in my relationship with my partner, Ben. He works away from home most weekends as a foreman on a construction site. I'd worry constantly until I knew he'd arrived at work safely. Then I'd be worrying that maybe he'd have an accident on site. So I often sent him lots of messages during the day to check that he was okay. This would annoy him, and we'd have big arguments. He'd call me irrational. All of this would just make me worry more, and made me want to send him more messages to make sure that he was okay. It wasn't just the big things I was worrying about. I found myself worrying about lots of smaller things too. Over time, I found most of my day was taken up by worry, and it was having a real impact on all aspects of my life now. So one day, after a full night of worrying and lack of sleep, I decided I needed to get on top of my worry, but had no idea where to start. I went to speak to my GP about how I was feeling. She recommended I saw a psychological wellbeing practitioner who worked in the practice. At first, I was really unsure. I just couldn't see how speaking with somebody could help with all my worries. However, a month later, I had an appointment with Mike. He asked me a lot of questions about the things I'd been going through and things I'd been worrying about in my head, how I felt in my body, and how things that I was doing were either helping or not, and whether my emotions were also being affected. At first, all these questions seemed a little bit odd, and I couldn't see how they were really relevant to me. However, when Mike related my difficulties to something called a vicious cycle worksheet, I started to make sense of it all. For the first time, I could see that what I did and that what I was thinking and how I felt physically also related to me emotionally, and they all had impacts on each other. They were all making each other worse. We spent time talking about how worry and anxiety may be helpful in some circumstances. However, when people find themselves worrying constantly about a lot of things, some of which simply can't be solved, this can negatively impact on lots of areas of life. We also spoke about how some people believe that worrying is always really useful and helpful, therefore constantly worrying to prepare for the worst case scenario, which was definitely me. In turn, our worries start to feel out of control, impacting on our sleep. We might even start to try and avoid things that we're worrying about rather than trying to solve them. This was also me. We then discussed how all the anxiety caused by constantly worrying makes us feel restless and affects our physical selves. Often people report feeling like they are tied up in a knot. They feel sick or overwhelmed. Too much anxiety can also upset our stomachs, and if too much bad energy and anxiety hangs around for long enough, it can even make us go to the loo a lot more. I began to see how my worries were clearly affecting me in my different areas of my life, and I was keen to find out what I could do to change this. Mike explained how he worked using a supported self-help approach based around a self-help workbook called Managing Your Worries. He explained how his approach was based on psychological therapies called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. The approach was based around two main techniques called worry time and problem solving. I liked the sound of problem solving. It seemed like a practical way forward, and I could definitely identify having a lot of problems that I was worrying about. Worry time sounded a bit odd though, especially at first. The idea that I would actually make time to worry sounded odd. However, it did make some sense that scheduling a specific time just to worry might help control my constant worrying throughout the day. Mike explained how it would work through the workbook in my own time, but that he would support me every week to keep on track and help me overcome the difficulties if I ran into them. Each support session would last about half an hour, and given how busy work was for me, this sounded just about manageable. Over the coming weeks, Mike helped me work through the workbook. When I started to write down all my worries, I realised just how many there were, and it all seemed a bit much. However, Mike explained a good first step was to think about my worries in the terms of those that were ones I could solve in that moment, practical worries, and ones that were important, but I was unable to solve them in that moment, hypothetical worries. I immediately noticed a lot of my worries were hypothetical, and I was having a lot of worries about work, such as, what if I miss my deadline? What if I get ill, which also means I can't meet my deadline? And what if I get sacked? Mike explained that what if worries are very common in people experiencing generalized anxiety disorder, but that worry time was an approach that could help. First, I had to schedule a specific time to dedicate to worrying each day for about 20 minutes. Each time I had a worry during the day, I'd write it down in my worry diary and then try to refocus on the present moment. When it came to my scheduled worry time, I could use this time to worry about the worries I had written down on my diary. I had to review what I had learnt also at that time. I tried the technique out during the week, but noticed that I had quite a bit of trouble refocusing on the present after writing my worry down in the middle of the day. During my next support session with Mike, I chatted to him about this, and he explained this was quite common. But then he went on to say that one way of refocusing on the present was to focus on the task I was doing using my senses. For example, if I was doing the washing up, to focus on things like the water temperature, the shape of the dishes I was washing up, and the scent of the washing up liquid. He also explained that using worry time takes practice, and over time, many people find it very helpful technique. As I continued to use the worry time, it became easier and easier, and I noticed that although it seemed like I was having hundreds of worries a day, I was actually having a lot of the same worries. I also noticed that quite a few of my worries were actually practical worries with a solution. So Mike helped me use the problem-solving method to tackle these worries too. I also realised that by the time it came to my scheduled worry time for the hypothetical worries, many of the worries I wrote down no longer actually bothered me. Over time, things really started to improve for me. I managed to start taking control of my worries rather than letting them control me. I noticed I was becoming more productive at work and argued far less with Ben. Of course, I still worry now and then. However, it's a lot less overwhelming. and I have learnt new ways to manage my worries. I'm really eager and able to problem solve the practical ones too.